June 19th, 1944, Western Pacific. 10:03 a.m. The sky was clean, open, and treacherously silent. 40 Japanese aircraft, twin rows of Aichi D-3A dive bombers and Mitsubishi A-6M0 escorts, carved a tight formation through the upper cloud band, heading southeast. Below them, the Mariana Islands blurred into the sea. Somewhere far ahead, American carriers waited. But the skies seemed empty. The ocean, still. In their cockpits, the Japanese pilots tightened harness straps and switched fuel tanks. No alarms, no resistance, not even a glint on the horizon. Just a long, quiet run. Then, chaos. American F-6F Hellcats came screaming down from above the sun, perfectly angled, guns hot, formation intact. It wasn't a chase, it wasn't a duel, it was an ambush. Within seconds, the formation was torn apart. Zeros spun out in flames, dive bombers shattered mid-drop, and the Pacific swallowed the wreckage in silence. By 10:09 a.m., 15 aircraft had vanished from the sky, and the rest was scattering, stunned and leaderless. None of them had seen it coming. What they didn't know was that the Americans had seen them first, 137 miles out, through radar, tracked, predicted, targeted. And for the first time in modern warfare, death came not from what you could see, but from what saw you. By the summer of 1944, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted. What had begun with shockwaves at Pearl Harbor now saw Japan slowly bleeding across a vast oceanic front. Island by island, airstrip by airstrip, the United States was closing in. Not with haste, but with overwhelming pressure, calculated logistics, and evolving technology. The Japanese Empire, once ascendant across Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific, now found itself on the defensive. Its perimeter was shrinking. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, names once alien to the American public, had been seared into the national consciousness through blood and headlines. Each battle showed the same pattern. What Japan gained through surprise and fanaticism, the U.S. took back with steel and scale. By 1944, the Marianas had become the next objective. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, these islands were not only strategic stepping stones to Tokyo, they also provided terrain for airstrips that would place the Japanese home islands within range of the new B-29 superfortress. Japanese leadership knew the stakes. A defense was inevitable. It would come from the sea and from the sky. To protect their territory, Japan mobilized nearly every remaining carrier group they had. Veteran pilots, albeit fewer than before, were loaded into aircraft and launched from flat-decked behemoths like the Zuikaku and Shokaku. They would be supported by land-based squadrons, hoping to pincer the U.S. fleet in a massive aerial clash. But what these Japanese pilots didn't understand, what few in the world yet grasped, was that the nature of air combat had changed. As early as 1942, U.S. scientists and naval planners had begun integrating radar into frontline operations. What had once been experimental coastal installations were now hardened technologies aboard carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. Radio waves could now detect aircraft hundreds of miles away, day or night, through clouds and darkness. What Japan relied on visually, formations, scouting aircraft, clear weather, the U.S. was now replacing with electrons, screens, and operators. Onboard U.S. carriers, combat information centers, CICs, had emerged as the nerve centers of every operation. These were darkened rooms crowded with radar screens, plotting tables, voice tubes, and radio relays. Technicians in headphones received bearing, altitude, and range updates from rotating antennae perched high on radar towers. They filtered data, translated patterns, and passed it to fighter direction officers, who, in turn, vectored squadrons with mathematical precision. This wasn't just a new tool, it was a new way of fighting. By 1944, the U.S. Navy's Task Force 58, an enormous carrier strike group, had fully embraced radar-directed warfare. Aircraft no longer scrambled blindly. They intercepted. They hunted. And for Japan, this was a deadly blind spot. While Japanese pilots still relied on visual scouting, cloud breaks, and formation signaling, American pilots were being fed vectors and altitudes in real time. From takeoff to interception, they followed instructions coming directly from radar operators. Even before they had visual confirmation, American squadrons knew where the enemy would be, and when they would get there. This new capability didn't just improve reaction time, it gave the US Navy the power to predict. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, air superiority had once been a badge of dominance. In the early years of the war, their fighter pilots were revered as lethal, almost mythical figures, precise, daring, and trained to a fault. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 had outmaneuvered everything the Allies could field in 1941 and 1942. Japanese carrier doctrine, built on aggressive strikes and tight air formations, seemed unstoppable. But by mid-1944, the myth had eroded. Their pilot training programs, once meticulous and grueling, had been condensed due to rising casualties. Japan could no longer replace experienced aviators fast enough. The result? Green pilots, undertrained and flying into modern warfare, shaped by radar, radio discipline, and mass production. The Zero, still agile, had become fragile in the face of rugged, faster, and more heavily armed US fighters like the F-6F Hellcat. Despite this decline, Japanese tactical doctrine remained largely unchanged. Coordinated mass attacks, often involving dozens of aircraft launched in staggered waves, were still the primary method of striking US carrier groups. Their success depended on two things: surprise and concentration. Radar erased both. At the heart of the American naval push across the Central Pacific stood Task Force 58, a massive, fast carrier strike group under the Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. Composed of 15 aircraft carriers, over 900 aircraft, 7 battleships, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers, it was a floating fortress. Its mission was clear: to neutralize the Marianas and shatter the Japanese fleet in the process. But unlike earlier campaigns, this time, Task Force 58 came equipped with an invisible shield: radar picket ships. These picket destroyers and cruisers were placed far ahead of the main formation. They carried early warning radar systems like the SC and SG sets, capable of detecting inbound aircraft over 100 miles away. These ships fed data directly to the combat information centers aboard carriers via voice radio, setting in motion a rapid chain of response. When blips appeared on the screen, fighter direction officers plotted bearing, range, altitude, and speed. Within minutes, American fighters were climbing into the sky, not to search, but to strike. This network of radar pickets, CICs, and disciplined communications meant Task Force 58 could see over the horizon, scramble exact numbers of interceptors, and engage the enemy before a single bomb could fall. The moment of reckoning came in June 1944. As US Marines landed on Saipan, the Japanese fleet mobilized from the Philippines and Central Pacific bases, their intent to crush the invasion with a decisive carrier strike. 4 major Japanese carrier groups approached under cover of night, coordinating massive airstrikes at dawn. Over 370 aircraft, bombers, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters would be launched in successive waves against the American fleet. But what the Japanese believed to be a surprise assault was already being tracked. Radar operators aboard the USS Lexington, USS Enterprise, and USS Princeton picked up formations hundreds of miles out. Atop towers, rotating antennae began plotting inbound arcs. CICs lit up with activity. Fighter direction officers calculated vectors. Pilots strapped in. Engines roared. By the time the first Japanese wave broke from the cloud cover, dozens of American Hellcats were already in the air, perfectly positioned, above them, behind them, waiting. And the ambush had only just begun. Radar was the invisible hand behind the US Navy's growing dominance in the Pacific. What had started as a British innovation was rapidly refined by American scientists through projects like the Radiation Laboratory at MIT and the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington. By 1944, carrier task forces were deploying multiple types of radar: air search (SC-SK), surface search (SG), and fire control Mach 3, Mach 4 systems, each tuned to a different part of the electromagnetic spectrum, each performing a specific battlefield function. What made radar revolutionary wasn't just detection, it was detection in depth, at range, with actionable precision. American radar could track incoming air formations before visual contact was possible, in any weather, at night or day. It provided real-time updates on range, bearing, speed, and altitude. This allowed fighter direction officers to coordinate the interception of enemy aircraft like a chess match, positioning squadrons at the ideal altitude and vector to strike without waste or guesswork. Radar had effectively turned the fog of war into a map. The Japanese, still reliant on visual sightings and scout planes, simply couldn't match this. Their aircraft flew into what they thought was empty sky. Instead, they entered pre-laid killing zones, controlled by invisible pulses and relayed through headsets and plotting boards. It wasn't just an ambush, it was a systematized erasure of surprise. Radar meant nothing without integration. And it was Combat Information Centers, CICs, that completed the revolution. Onboard U.S. carriers like the USS Enterprise and USS Bunker Hill, CICs acted as centralized data hubs. Crewed by trained officers and enlisted radar operators, these windowless rooms processed every radar contact and issued interception instructions within minutes. As Japanese formations approached on June 19, 1944, the CIC aboard the USS Lexington plotted the first wave. Their report: large enemy strike, 137 miles out, bearing 265, altitude 14,000 feet. Within 2 minutes, F-6F Hellcat squadrons from 3 carriers had been scrambled. But they weren't just sent toward the enemy. They were vectored, instructed in bearing, climb, and intercept point. Controllers updated pilots mid-flight via radio, even adjusting based on enemy turns or speed changes. This wasn't just fast reaction. It was proactive destruction. Japanese aircraft were engaged before they ever saw the American carriers. Dive bombers were intercepted while still forming up. Torpedo planes were ambushed before their runs. Escorting Zeros were pulled into dogfights at altitudes where they were least effective. In less than 6 minutes, 15 aircraft were gone, and the U.S. fleet remained untouched. The Americans were no longer reacting to enemy strikes. They were eliminating them before they began. For the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, combat had always been visual. The art of the intercept relied on keen eyes, open sky, and tight formations. Battles were fought within sight, fighter to fighter, wingtip to wingtip. Their training emphasized aggression, maneuverability, and sacrifice. Technology, if present, was mechanical, not electronic. So on June 19, 1944, as dozens of aircraft flew toward the U.S. fleet, believing they had the element of surprise, the reality came as a psychological ambush. From their cockpits, Japanese aviators saw clear skies and no resistance. Then, without warning, American Hellcats dropped out of the clouds with speed and authority. Zeros were cut down before they could turn. Bombers were torn, apart mid-formation. There was no time to brake, no time to radio, no sense of where the enemy even was until the tracers were already in the air. To the Japanese, it felt like being hunted by a ghost. Some pilots later recounted that American aircraft seemed to appear from nowhere and always knew where we were. Others noted how their formations were hit at the weakest point, from behind, above, and out of the sun, with surgical timing. It wasn't just overwhelming numbers. It was as if the enemy had seen the entire plan. They had. And for the first time in the Pacific, Japanese aircrews realized they were no longer the silent predators. They were the prey. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher was not a man of dramatics. A veteran of early naval aviation, he believed in technology only when it delivered results. But by 1944, he had become one of radar's strongest advocates. Under his command, Task Force 58 had transformed into a model of electronic warfare coordination, fusing radar, radio, and aircraft into a single fighting organism. He empowered CIC teams. He ensured fighter direction officers received the best intelligence available. He demanded that radar contacts be acted upon immediately, not debated. Under Mitcher's leadership, radar was no longer a passive observer. It was an active weapon. On June 19th, that weapon fired without launching a single shell. While Japanese commanders still issued top-down, inflexible orders to their squadrons, Mitcher's command structure was dynamic. Radar teams spoke directly with pilots. Interceptors received course corrections in real time. Officers adjusted plans mid-flight based on new data. This was a different kind of war, one no longer dictated by what the eye could see or what tradition allowed. In those 6 deadly minutes, as wave after wave of Japanese aircraft fell from the sky, the future of naval command had arrived. It was no longer about who launched first. It was about who knew first. 10:03 a.m., June 19th, 1944. The radar scopes aboard the U.S. Lexington flickered to life with clarity. A large cluster of contacts, faint at first, emerged from the west. Bearing 265. Distance 137 miles. Altitude 14,000 feet. Speed climbing. Fighter Direction Officer Lieutenant Commander Bill Coleman leaned over the plotting table, connecting vector lines across the transparent plexiglass. "Looks like the first wave," he said to no one in particular. Then into his headset. "Launch interceptors." Hellcats roared off carrier decks like arrows from a bow. Atop the USS Bunker Hill, USS Enterprise, and USS Princeton, flight crews scrambled with practiced precision. Each launch took seconds. By the time the radar contacts crossed the 100-mile mark, over 60 American fighters were airborne, climbing in wide spirals under full throttle. But this wasn't a simple scramble. Every American pilot received exact bearings and altitudes from radar operators. They weren't searching for the enemy. They were being guided to them. The lead wave of Japanese aircraft, comprising dive bombers escorted by Mitsubishi Zeros, flew in disciplined formation, unaware they were already inside a kill zone mapped miles ago. They believed they still had time. They were wrong. At 10:09 a.m., high above the Philippine Sea, the first visual contact occurred. Not by the Japanese, but by the Americans. Hellcats dropped from the sky with speed, coordination, and silence. They dove in pairs, guns blazing, targeting the unarmored bellies of the dive bombers first. Bombers carrying 250 kiloton payloads erupted mid-air. Zeros turned to engage, but they were outnumbered and outpositioned. The sky was instantly filled with crisscrossing contrails, plumes of smoke, and aircraft spiraling into the sea. The radar team aboard the USS Lexington began marking kills. 1, 2, 3 more. Then silence. 6 minutes had passed. 15 Japanese aircraft were gone. No American carrier had even been seen, let alone touched, and the U.S. pilots were already refueling, rearming, or climbing for the next wave. Aboard the Japanese carrier Shokaku, the first reports were vague. Radio contact with the lead formation was garbled, incomplete. Some pilots tried to signal that they were under attack. Others were already dead. Commanders believed the first wave had simply lost formation or overshot their bearing. They still assumed the carriers lay ahead. They didn't know their aircraft had never even reached visual range. They had simply vanished, erased in the space between radar contact and gunfire. This was not a skirmish. It was a massacre by design. And more was coming. The initial wave was only the beginning. Over the course of June 19, 1944, the Japanese launched 4 major strike groups toward the American fleet. Each was large, each intended to overwhelm, and each was intercepted long before it could reach its target. After the first slaughter, the second wave approached from a different bearing, hoping to exploit a perceived gap. But the American radar network didn't care about gaps. SC and SK air search radars aboard picket destroyers and cruisers like the USS Cassin Young and USS Biloxi had already picked up the new formation. Data flowed seamlessly back to the combat information centers aboard carriers. Fighter director teams recalibrated vectors. Fresh squadrons of F-6F Hellcats were dispatched at higher altitude this time, meeting the Japanese force head-on at 20,000 feet. Again, it was over in minutes. One Japanese pilot managed to reach visual range of the American fleet, only to be shot down before he could dive. His final transmission described, "Impossible timing. They are already here." American gunners never fired a shot. Their aircraft had already eliminated the threat miles out. It was like shooting pigeons. By noon, the air battle had become a rout. Japanese formations broke apart before completing their approach. Individual aircraft scattered, climbing or diving in confusion. Radio discipline disintegrated. Some Zeros tried to circle back. Others jettisoned their payloads just to maneuver faster. The Americans followed with cold efficiency. One U.S. pilot from the USS Belleau Wood described it as like shooting pigeons in a tunnel. The Hellcats, with superior firepower, armor, and dive acceleration, tore through enemy aircraft in 2s and 3s. Japanese dive bombers, flying in long, straight lines during their approach runs, became easy targets. Their outdated designs couldn't climb fast enough to evade. Their gunners couldn't cover all angles. Their formations made them easy to track. And they had no radar, no coordination, and no warning. American aircraft losses by the end of the day, less than 30. Japanese aircraft losses over 300. Aboard Japanese flagships like the Taiho and Zuikaku, the lack of returning squadrons caused confusion. Signals officers couldn't raise their pilots. Flight crews stood waiting for landings that never came. By mid-afternoon, it was clear something unprecedented had happened. The Japanese had launched their largest coordinated air assault since Midway, and had virtually nothing to show for it. They hadn't even found the enemy. As evening fell, the sea was dotted with oil slicks, smoldering wreckage, and drifting parachutes. The U.S. fleet had not only survived, it had decimated the last great offensive air power Japan could field, and it had done so using screens, signals, and silent detection. The radar war had begun. The numbers told the story. By nightfall on June 19, 1944, Japan had lost over 300 aircraft, more than half of its deployed strike force. Some estimates suggest the number approached 350 when accounting for damaged aircraft that failed to return or ditched at sea. In contrast, American losses across all Task Force 58 carriers totaled just 29 aircraft, many of which were lost due to fuel shortages, mechanical failures, or crash landings, not enemy fire. It was the most one-sided carrier-based air battle in naval history. The U.S. pilots, many of them experiencing their first major engagement, had entered the fight with detailed intercept instructions, superior firepower, and complete command support. The F-6F Hellcat, designed specifically to counter the Zero, had proven its dominance in every metric: speed, climb rate, firepower, survivability. Backed by radar vectoring, the aircraft wasn't just effective, it was lethal by design. For Japan, the human toll was devastating. Unlike the Americans, whose pilot training programs could produce thousands of new aviators a year, the Imperial Japanese Navy had leaned heavily on an elite, tightly trained cadre. It took 5 to 7 years to create a seasoned pilot in the pre-war system. That system was now broken, and so were its pilots. Veterans from Midway, Coral Sea, and the Indian Ocean, raids were among those lost on June 19th. Replacements in training lacked experience in dogfighting, formation flying, or even takeoff under combat pressure. The air wing of the first mobile fleet, Japan's last great carrier strike group, had been functionally wiped out in a single day. And the Americans weren't done. The defeat wasn't only in the sky, it was structural. By June 20th, American submarines had already begun trailing the Japanese fleet. The USS Albacore and USS Kavala, patrolling the waters west of the Marianas, struck two of Japan's fleet carriers, Shokaku and Taiho. Both were sunk by torpedoes within 24 hours of the air battle. Carrier Zuikaku, the only survivor of the original Pearl Harbor strike group, limped away with heavy damage. Without planes or experienced pilots, she was a carrier in name only. The air group she once supported had been reduced to charred fuselages and empty radio frequencies. Japan's entire mobile air strategy, once the terror of the Pacific, had collapsed under the weight of invisible American eyes. The catastrophic losses suffered on June 19, 1944, forced the Imperial Japanese Navy into an irreversible corner. The aircraft destroyed could, in theory, be rebuilt. The carriers damaged could be repaired. But the pilots, the human edge of Japanese naval power, were gone. Without them, the flat tops were toothless. The idea of another mass carrier strike was no longer operationally feasible. Even if Japan could refit and rearm its ships, there was no one left to fly from their decks. Those who remained were largely green, hastily trained recruits, no match for the battle-hardened U.S. aviators who gained experience with every sortie. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, as it came to be known, was more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic decapitation. It destroyed Japan's ability to project air power at sea, and it solidified U.S. dominance of the Central Pacific. Just days later, American troops began consolidating their hold on Saipan. From there, U.S. engineers would construct long-range airfields, launching the B-29 Superfortress bombing campaign, a direct result of the sea battle that gave them the skies. But perhaps the most lasting impact wasn't mechanical or territorial, it was psychological. With its carrier air wings shattered and conventional aerial tactics rendered ineffective by radar and American coordination, Japan made a fateful shift. Later in 1944, as U.S. forces closed in on the Philippines, Japanese planners authorized a new strategy: intentional suicide attacks. Thus began the kamikaze program. Pilots trained not to return, but to crash directly into enemy vessels. It was a doctrine born not of confidence, but of despair. The Americans had made it impossible to fight on equal terms. Radar denied Japan the advantage of stealth. Fighter coordination nullified their numbers. Fire control systems shredded any attackers who got through. Faced with annihilation in the air, Japan's only perceived alternative was to weaponize death itself. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, and specifically the 6-minute slaughter that began it, had signaled to Japan's high command that the era of conventional carrier warfare was over. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot wasn't named by commanders. It was coined by pilots, young men returning from the sky in disbelief at how lopsided the day had been. They joked, half shocked, that it had been too easy. Behind the grim humor was a grim truth. The enemy was no longer flying blind. Now they were flying into machines that could see first, aim first, and kill first, and the war would never be the same. The Battle of the Philippine Sea wasn't decided by brute force. It wasn't won by sheer numbers, firepower, or even daring pilots. It was decided before the first dogfight, before the first engine roared to life. It was won on radar screens. The technology that quietly tracked blips across a darkened combat information center, that translated invisible waves into vectors and altitude readouts, had redefined the laws of engagement. In those 6 fateful minutes, when 15 aircraft vanished from the sky without warning, the future of warfare was no longer speculative. It was operational. Japan had entered the war with mastery of the unexpected. But by 1944, It was the United States that had become the master of unseen advantage. Where Japan relied on vision and valor, America relied on detection, coordination, and predictive interception. It was less romantic, but it was unstoppable. Radar removed the element of surprise from warfare and handed it to those who could see what others could not. It shifted combat from the realm of reaction to the domain of anticipation. In doing so, it shortened battles, saved lives, and collapsed strategies that had once seemed formidable. And in the empty skies over the Philippine Sea, that shift became undeniable. The Japanese pilots never saw what hit them, because the war had already passed beyond what the eye could see.